street on the way out of town, they saw a group of people standing by the courthouse, looking up at a window. Joining the group, they found that a prisoner was talking to the people below. He talked angrily and fast, claiming that he had fought hard in the war and had killed many Federals. He had been shot in the shoulder at Williamsburg. But he had recently stopped believing in the war, and since he had joined the army out of choice, his only crime was his decision to leave and walk home. Now, here he was in prison, and they might hang him, though he had fought like a hero. The prisoner then told the crowd that the Home Guard had taken him some days previously from his father's farm in the mountains. He had been hiding there with other outliers. It had been early evening when the outliers and the prisoner's father had heard the sound of horses approaching. His father took his gun and went out to the road, while the outliers ran to hide in the barn. A small group of horsemen came slowly around the bend. There were two great dark men who looked like each other, and a thin white-headed boy wearing farm clothes. The fourth man looked like a traveling preacher in his long black coat and white shirt. "Stop right there," the prisoner's father said to the horsemen when they were some distance away. They did not stop immediately, but came closer. The old man said to the man in the black coat, "I know who you are. You're Teague. Get over here." Teague looked at the old man with dead eyes and did not move. The other men got off their horses. Suddenly, the white-headed boy fell down in the dirt and screamed. The old man turned to look at him, and as he did, one of the black men hit the old man hard on the head and then knocked his gun from his hand. The old man fell on his back, and the black man beat him with his gun until he lay still. Then he took his sword and stuck it into the old man's stomach. The boy got up and stood over the man and looked at him. "He's ready to meet his maker," he said. Laughing, the four approached the house, walking around it 3 times before bursting through the front and back doors at the same moment. Within minutes, they were out again, carrying a cooked chicken and 2 sacks of potatoes, which they put in their baskets. Then, without a word, they went toward the barn. As they approached it, the door flew open, and the 3 outliers ran out, holding farm tools as weapons. Teague put his gun to his shoulder and shot the first 2 men, who fell to the ground. The last man, the prisoner, stopped, dropped his weapon, and raised his hands. Teague looked at him a minute, then said to the white-headed boy, "Birch, get me some to tie his hands, and we'll lead him back to town on the end of a line." The boy went to the horses and came back with some rope. But when they tried to tie the prisoner, he fought and screamed. Finally, they managed to throw him to the ground and put his wrists and ankles together. "He's a madman," Birch said. They brought a chair from the house and tied the man into it. "I'm thinking we should hang him from the top of the barn," Teague said. "It'd look better if we brought someone into town now and then," Birch said. The men talked for a while and decided that Birch was right. They tied the chair to the cart that stood in the yard, then fixed the cart to a horse and set off for town. By the time the prisoner had stopped talking, the sun had set, and Ruby and Ada turned from the courthouse and started walking home. For a time, they were wordless with shock. But later they discussed the prisoner's story. Ada was not sure it was completely true, but Ruby said that it fitted what she knew of men's natures. Chapter 7. 2 Women. Inman followed the yellow man's map through what the people of the area called hill country. Nights were cool, and the leaves were beginning to change color. There was too much open ground to feel good about walking by day, and by night the roads were so full of dark riders that Inman spent as much time hiding in bushes as walking. As soon as he could, Inman left the dangerous roads of the valleys and took a narrow path that aimed north toward the mountains. He climbed for part of one day and all of the next, and there was still a wall of mountain rising in front of him. Late in the afternoon, cold rain began falling, and it was past the middle of the night when he came to a big tree with a large hole in it. He climbed inside, glad to find a dry place, and fell asleep. He woke soon after dawn, feeling tired, ill, and stiff, with the wounds in his head and neck burning hot. All the food he had left in his knapsack was a cup of cornmeal, and it was too wet to make a fire. He sat for a time on a rock, and then got up and walked all morning through the dark woods. The path went up and up, and Inman had no idea where it was leading. Near midday, he came around a bend and saw a tiny person leaning over a bush. When he came closer, he saw that it was a little old woman who was putting food in a bird trap. Inman stopped and said, "Hello, ma'am." The little woman looked up at him. She was quite old, that was clear, but her cheeks were as pink and fine as a girl's. She wore a man's hat, and her thin white hair hung to her shoulders. Her full skirt and blouse were made of animal skins, and she had a gun in her belt. "I'm wondering if this road goes anywhere," Inman said.
"It goes west, I believe,"
the woman said. "Thank you," said Inman. The woman looked at Inman.
"Those look like bullet holes in your head," she said. "You look faint. White."
"I'm fine," Inman said.
"You look like you could eat something. I'd be glad if you'd take shelter and dinner at my camp."
"Then I'd be a fool to say no," Inman said. Inman followed the woman as she climbed to a bend, and from there they left the forest and walked on great rocks along the side of a mountain. A river gorge stretched blue and purple far below them. Then they entered a narrow path cut into the mountain, and soon came to a dark cove with a little stream running through it. A small caravan stood in a space surrounded by trees. Birds walked on the roof of the caravan, whose sides were painted with colorful scenes, and plants had twisted themselves around the wheels. The woman stopped and shouted,
"Hey!"
and about 24 goats came out of the woods, their yellow eyes bright and smart, the bells around their necks ringing. The woman disappeared around the side of the caravan, and the goats followed her. Inman found her building up her cooking fire, and when it was burning well, Inman went to it and put out his hands to warm. A little brown and white goat came to the woman, and she stroked it and scratched its neck until it lay down. Inman thought it was a peaceful scene. Then, with one smooth movement, she took a knife from her pocket and cut deep into the animal's neck. The little goat's body shook as she continued to stroke it until it lay still. Inman watched the old woman as she cut the goat's body into pieces, some of which she put over the fire to cook. Other pieces she put in a pot with water and vegetables.
"By dinner time, we'll have a good meal," she said.
Later, the rain started again, and Inman went into the caravan and sat by the tiny stove. There was a table piled high with papers and books, and on the walls there were drawings of plants, some colored, with a great deal of tiny writing around the edges of the paper. The woman fried some bread and gave it to Inman, together with some meat. "Thank you," said Inman, eating it fast. While he ate, she began making cheese from goat's milk. When she was finished, she handed him some of the milk. Then she sat in a chair by the stove and took her shoes off.
"Did you run off from the war?"
she asked. Inman showed her the angry cut at his neck. "Wounded and sent home," he said.
"Oh, I'm sure,"
she answered. "How long have you been camped here?" asked Inman. She thought for a minute.
26 years,
she said. "Never married?"
"Yes, I was. Though I guess he's dead now. I was a stupid little girl, and he was old. He'd already had 3 wives who'd all died. There was a boy I liked, but this man had a nice farm, and my family sold me to him. He treated me like a slave. I got up one night and rode away before dawn on his best horse. I've been alone since then. There's a little town about a half-day's walk away. I sell cheese there and medicines that I make from plants.
She looked at him carefully.
Those new wounds in your head are not so bad. When they heal up, the hair will cover them, and no one will know they're there.
Then she said,
Listen, I don't care that you've run off from the war. It's dangerous for you, that's all.
He looked her in the eyes and saw that they were full of kindness. For a long time he had not met anyone who he trusted the way he did this goat woman. So he told her what was in his heart. The shame he felt about shooting the Federals, men like him who ran at guns and died. Then he told her how that morning he had found a bush of dusty blue berries. He had picked them and eaten them for breakfast, and watched as some birds had flown across the sky toward the south. At least nature doesn't change, he thought. Inman had seen only change for 4 years, and guessed that people fought wars because they were bored. But sooner or later, you get tired of watching people kill each other. So that morning, he had looked at the berries and felt happy, knowing that nature continued unchanging. The woman thought about what he had said, then got up and took a bottle containing a thick liquid from her cupboard. She went to Inman and rubbed the liquid on the wounds on his head and neck. When she had finished, she handed the bottle to him.
Take it with you, she said. Rub it on thick until it's gone. And take these, too. Take one a day, starting now.
She took some large pills from a purse and put them in his hand. Sometime in the evening, they ate the roast meat and the food in the pot. They sat side by side and listened to the faint rain come down in the woods. To Inman's surprise, he started talking about Ada, describing her character and her beauty, and his realization that he loved her and wanted to marry her. Then they sat for a time without talking, while the rain came down harder. "It must get cold in winter up here," Inman said.
"Cold enough. I keep the fire hot and the blankets deep, and I'm careful not to let my ink and paints freeze."
"What is it that you do in those books?" Inman asked.
"I draw pictures and write."
"About what?"
"Everything. The goats, plants, weather. I keep a record."
"And you've spent your life this way?"
"Until now I have. I'm not dead yet."
"Don't you get lonely?"
"Sometimes, yes. But there's plenty of work."
The rain began falling harder, and they stopped their talking, and Inman went on his hands and knees under the caravan, rolled up in his blankets, and slept. He rose at dawn and packed his things. "I need to go," he told the old woman. "But I'd like to pay you for the food and medicine."
"You could try,"
the woman said,
"but I wouldn't take it."
"Well, thank you," Inman said.
"Listen," the woman said. "If I had a boy, I'd tell him the same as I'm telling you. Watch out for yourself."
"I will," Inman said. He turned to walk out of the caravan, but she stopped him. She said,
"Here, take this with you."
And she handed him a square of paper, on which was drawn in great detail a branch of blue-purple berries. Inman wandered the mountains for days, lost in the fog and rain that never seemed to stop. He used the goat woman's medicine until it was gone, and the wounds in his neck and head had healed. His knapsack became empty of food. At first he hunted, but without success. He tried fishing, but there were few fish in the mountain streams. He felt like a wild animal, almost mad with hunger. God, if I could grow wings and fly, he thought, I would be gone from this place. I'd fly far away and watch the world from a high rock. Then, just as he thought that he could go no further, he came to a lonely little one-room cabin set above the road. The windows were pieces of paper. There was a pig making noises by the fence. Inman stepped up to the gate and shouted, and a young woman, a girl really, came to the door and looked out. She was a tight-skinned, pretty little thing, and wore a light cotton dress that did not suit the weather. She looked at him for a minute, and then said,
"Well, come in."
"I'll pay for what I eat," said Inman.
"I have very little, but I won't take money. There's cornbread and beans, that's all."
She turned and walked into the house. Inman followed. The room was dark, lit only by the fire, and though there was very little furniture, the room was clean. A small baby lay warmly wrapped on the bed. The woman pulled one of the chairs to the fire and pointed to Inman to sit, and in a minute a faint steam had begun to rise from his wet clothes. She served him a plate piled high with beans and bread. Inman started eating loudly and fast, while the woman sat watching him with some disgust. "I'm sorry. I've not taken actual food in days," he said.
"There's no need to be sorry,"
she replied. Inman looked at her closely for the first time. "How old are you?" he asked.
18.
"Name's Inman. Yours?"
"Sarah."
"Why are you here all alone?"
"My man John went off to the fighting. He died some months ago. They killed him up in Virginia. He never saw his baby, and it's just the two of us now."
Inman sat silent for a minute. "Do you have any help here?" he said.
"None.
"How do you manage?"
I use a little plow to grow corn and vegetables, and there are a few chickens for the eggs. That pig is our food for the winter. I have to kill it soon, but I've never killed a pig before."
Listening to her, Inman thought that she would be old in 5 years' time. He saw all the world hanging over the girl like a trap, ready to drop and destroy her. "I could help," he said.
"I couldn't ask it. I'd have to do it as an exchange. I could clean and sew up the holes in those clothes of yours. And you could put on clothes my man left. He was about as tall as you are."
She left the room and returned with a pile of folded clothes, a clean pair of good boots, and a bowl of water and soap. He stepped outside, took off his clothes, and washed himself. Then he dressed. The dead man's clothes fitted quite well, and the boots were perfect. When he went back indoors, he felt like the ghost of her husband. They sat quietly by the fire for a time. Then she said,
"You'll have to sleep in the hen house."
He walked out and took his knapsack and went to the hen house. It was almost freezing, and he rolled himself in his wet blankets. He'd only just fallen asleep when he was woken up by the girl.
"Come inside, please,"
she said. And she turned and walked away. When he went back inside, she was in bed, her hair spread thick across her shoulders.
"If I asked you to lay in bed with me but not do anything else, could you do it?"
she said. Inman looked at her and wondered what she saw looking back. A stranger filling the clothes of her husband. "Yes," he said. He went over, pulled off his boots, and climbed under the bed covers. They both kept absolutely still. Then she started to cry, her chest shaking. After a time, she sat up and started talking about her husband. She just wanted Inman to listen to her story, and every time he tried to speak, she silenced him. When she had finished talking, she reached out and touched the cut in Inman's neck. She rested her hand there for a moment before taking it away, then rolled over with her back to him and soon fell asleep. But tired as he was, Inman could not rest. A woman had not touched him like that for so long that he hardly saw himself as human. He saw his life now as a dark mistake, and did not even think it possible to pull Sarah to him and hold her close until daylight. Inman was woken by Sarah shaking his shoulder and saying urgently, "Get up and get out." It was gray dawn, and the cabin was freezing cold, and there was the faint sound of horses coming up the road.
"If it's the home guard, it would be better for both of us if you were not here."
Inman pulled on his boots and rushed out the back door to the line of trees beyond the stream. There he hid behind a bush that gave him a view of the front of the house. He could see Sarah run across to where the pig slept. She was driving the animal toward the woods when there was a call from down the road. "Stop right there." Blue jackets. Federals. Inman saw 3 men on horses, all carrying guns. One of the men went to her and told her to sit on the ground. The pig sat on the ground beside her. The other 2 men went into the house, and there was the sound of things breaking. When the men reappeared, one of them carried the baby. It was crying, and Sarah begged them to give her the child, but they would not. Then Inman could hear that they were asking her about money, where she had it hidden. Sarah told the truth, that she only had what they could see. They asked again and again, and then led her to the porch and tied her to it. One of the men took the baby's clothes off and lay the child on the frozen ground. Inman could hear one of the men say, "We have all day." And then he could hear Sarah scream. The men searched the yard, hoping to find money or jewelry buried in the earth, but they found nothing. Then the leader walked to Sarah and pointed his gun at her. "You really don't have anything, do you?" One of the men gave the baby to her. Then they gathered up the chickens and hung them on their horses. When Sarah saw the leader taking the pig away, she shouted,
"That pig's all I have. Take it, and you'll kill us both."
But the men climbed on their horses and went down the road, leading the pig behind them on the end of a rope. When they had disappeared, Inman ran to Sarah. He said, "Warm up your baby, and then build a fire as high as your head and put a big pot on to boil." And he ran down the road. He followed the Federals, wondering what he intended to do. They did not go far before they built a fire and tied the pig to a tree. Then they killed 2 chickens and put them to roast on the fire. Inman circled the area, and in the rocks near the camp he found a shallow cave. Returning to the edge of the men's camp, he climbed a big tree. In just a minute, one of the men walked under the tree and stopped. Inman said, "Hey!" The man looked up, and Inman shot him. The bullet entered at the shoulder and left through the stomach. The man fell to the ground immediately. "Did you hit it?" one of the men in the camp called out. Inman climbed down from the tree, circled the camp, hid behind a bush, and waited. Soon the men went to find their friend. Inman followed them. Discovering that he was dead, they stood for a time and talked about what they ought to do. They decided to look for the killer. Inman followed them, moving nearer and nearer. When he shot them, he was so near he was almost touching them. They fell in a pile. "If you'd stayed home, this wouldn't have happened," Inman said. He dragged all 3 bodies to the cave and sat them up together. Then he led the horses far beyond the cave and shot them in the heads. It was not a happy thing to do, but he knew that if he left them free, people would come looking for their owners. Finally, he returned to the camp, picked up the cooked chickens, and led the pig back down the road. When he returned to the cabin, Sarah had built a good fire in the yard, and there was a big pot of water boiling over it. They had an early lunch of the cooked chickens and then started work. Within 2 hours, the pig had been killed, skinned, and cut into sections. They worked until dark, using all the parts of the pig and salting the meat. Then they washed and went inside, and Sarah cooked. After dinner, Sarah said,
"You'd look better if you shaved."
So Inman shaved in front of a metal mirror. The eyes that looked back at him had a look that he did not remember, a look that was more than just food hunger. It was a killer face, with eyes that looked at you sideways. But Inman tried to believe that this face was not him in any true way, and that it could, in time, be changed for a better one. When he came back in, Sarah smiled at him and said,
"You look part human now."
They sat and looked at the fire, and Sarah held the baby in her lap. It would not sleep, so she sang it a song which expressed such loneliness that it hurt Inman to hear it. The sound was of an old, tired woman, and Sarah was so young to sound that way. For the rest of the evening, they hardly talked, but sat side by side in front of the fire, rested and happy. And later, they again lay in bed together. The next morning, Inman ate the brains of the pig before setting off on his journey again. Chapter 8. Stowbroad returns. As the fall progressed, Ruby made plans for the coming winter. One afternoon, she threw 2 big sacks of apples over Ralph, the horse, and set off for town. She returned carrying 6 sacks of vegetables that she had exchanged for the apples. When she saw Ada, she handed her a letter, dirty as an old work glove. Ada recognized the handwriting, but put the letter away, not wanting to read it while Ruby watched. That evening, when Ruby had gone to bed, Ada sat on the porch and took the letter from her pocket. By now, she had read it several times. She found parts of it hard to understand. Inman seemed to feel that there were strong feelings between them, although Ada could not say exactly how she felt. She had not seen Inman in almost 4 years, and it had been more than 4 months since she had last heard from him. The letter she held now was without date, and she did not know if it had been written a week ago or was 3 months old. He mentioned that he was wounded and talked about coming home. But did he mean now, or at the end of the war? She tried to read the letter in the dark. The only part she could see clearly was this short paragraph. "If you still possess the photograph of me that I sent 4 years ago, I ask you, please throw it away. I no longer look the same in any way." Ada, of course, went immediately to her bedroom and opened drawers until she found the photograph. She had put it away because she had never thought it looked much like Inman. His expression in the picture was very serious, and didn't look like her memory of him on the last day before he left for the war. He had come to the house to say goodbye. He was, at the time, living in a room in the town, but planning to leave in 2 days, 3 at the most. They had walked together down to the stream beyond the fields. Inman, as they talked, was sometimes serious and sometimes cheerful. Ada found herself wondering,
"What will I feel if he is killed?"
But she could not, of course, say the thought aloud. She did not have to, though, because Inman at that moment said, "If I am shot to death, in 5 years you'll hardly remember my name."
"You know it's not that way,"
she said. In her heart, though, she wondered,
"Is anything remembered forever?"
Inman looked away and seemed to be made shy by what he had said. "Look there," he said. He looked up at Cold Mountain, which was wintry and gray. He started telling her a story about the mountain that he had heard from an old Indian woman. It was about a village called Canoga that many years ago stood on the Pigeon River. One day, a stranger had come into Canoga, and the people had fed him. As he ate, they asked him if he came from far away. "No," he said, I live in a town near here." He pointed in the direction of Cold Mountain. "There is no village up there," the people said. "Oh yes," the stranger said. "The shining rocks are the entrance to our country." "But I've been to the shining rocks many times, and have seen no such country," said one man, and others agreed, because they knew the place he spoke of well. "You must fast," the stranger said. "If not, we see you, but you do not see us. Our land is not like yours. Here there is constant fighting and sickness, and soon an enemy will come and take your country away from you. But there we have peace. And although we die, as all men do, and must hunt for food, our minds are not filled with fear. I have come to invite you to live with us. But before you come, you must fast for 7 days. Then climb to the shining rocks, and they will open like a door, and you may enter our country and live with us." Having said this, the stranger went away. After much discussion, the people decided to accept the invitation. They did not eat for 7 days, all except for one man who, each night, secretly went to his house and ate meat. On the morning of the 7th day, the people climbed toward the shining rocks, arriving at sunset. When the people stood in front of the white rocks, a cave opened like a door, and they saw that it was light inside, not dark. In the distance, inside the mountain, they could see a river and fields of corn. Then there was thunder, and the sky turned black. The people were frightened, but only the man who had eaten the meat became really afraid. He gave a cry of terror, and immediately the thunder stopped, and the cave door closed, so that there was only the white rock, shining in the last light of the sun. The people went sadly back to Kanuga. Soon the stranger's words came true, and their land was taken from them. When Inman was finished, Ada said,
"That was a strange story. You don't believe it, do you?"
She immediately regretted saying this, because the story obviously meant something to Inman. He looked at her, and then at the stream. Then he said, "That old woman looked older than God, and she cried tears when she told the story."
"But it can't be true,"
Ada said. "I believe it's true that she had the chance to live in a better world, and somehow she lost it." Neither of them knew what to say next, so Inman said, "I need to go." He took Ada's hand and put his lips to the back of it before letting it go. He had walked some distance before he turned around and saw Ada turning to walk to the house. Too soon. She had not even waited for him to pass the first bend in the road. Realizing what she had done, Ada stopped and looked at Inman. Inman turned to face her and said, "You don't have to stand watching me."
"I know I don't,"
Ada said. "You don't want to. I can see that."
"It wouldn't help,"
she said. "It might make some men feel better." He took off his hat and raised it to her. "I'll see you when I see you," he said. They walked away, this time without looking back. That night, though, Ada did not feel happy about Inman going to war. It worried her that she had not cried, or said what thousands of women said as men left, that they would wait for the man's return forever. She suspected that, out of habit, she had been distant and cold, and she feared that one day she would find that she could show no other feelings to the world. She slept badly. Her thoughts were turning to Inman again and again. But when she woke the next morning, she felt clear-headed and bright, and decided to correct her mistake. The day was cloudless and warm. Ada told Monroe that she wanted to go into town, and they drove off in the carriage. When they got there, Monroe gave her $20 and told her to buy something nice. They separated, and Ada bought a book and a scarf. Then, knowing it was not how a young lady should behave, she walked to the place where Inman was staying and climbed the steps to his door. Inman's face showed surprise when he saw Ada. He came out of his room and crossed his arms. There was a long silence. She said,
"I wanted to tell you that I thought things ended badly yesterday. Not at all as I wished them to be."
Inman's mouth tightened. He said, "I don't believe I understand you. I didn't expect anything different." At Inman's reply, Ada thought about walking away and putting him forever behind her. But she said,
"We might never speak again, and I know I disappointed you yesterday. I didn't follow my heart. I'm sorry for that."
"It's too late," Inman said, still standing with his arms crossed, and Ada reached out and pulled until she unlocked his arms. Then she took his wrist and held it. Neither of them, for a moment, could look the other in the face. Then Inman pulled his hand away and threw his hat in the air and caught it. They both smiled, and Inman put one hand to Ada's waist and pulled her to him for the kiss they had not given each other the day before. They walked together down the steps, feeling that a promise had been made. "I hope I see you soon," Inman said.
"We both do then,"
Ada replied. One afternoon, as Ruby was working in the yard, she saw a man in dark clothes and a big gray hat coming toward her, with a smile on his face.
"So you're not dead,"
Ruby said.
"Not yet,"
said Stowbroad. Ruby looked at him. He had changed. He seemed such an old, small man, with his hair half gone from his head.
"How old are you now?"
she said. He thought for a minute.
"Maybe 45,
he said.
"You've run up from the fighting, no doubt." "I've fought like a hero." "You sit on the porch steps and I'll bring you some food,"
Ruby said. She went inside and found Ada sitting by the window in the kitchen.
"My daddy's out on the porch,"
Ruby said.
"Pardon?"
"Stowbroad. He's come home from the war. But I don't care. A plate of food, and then we'll send him away."
Ruby put some food on a plate and carried it out to the table underneath the apple tree.
"He could eat in here,"
Ada said.
"No,"
Ruby said. They watched from the window as Stowbroad ate, then Ruby went out to collect his plate.
"Have you somewhere to go?"
she asked. Stowbroad told her that he was living with a group of outliers in a deep cave in the mountains. They wished only to hunt and eat, get drunk, and make music.
"Well, I guess that suits you,"
said Ruby. She waved at him to leave, and he walked off, in the direction of Cold Mountain. The two women did not think that they would see Stowbroad again, but the next evening, as they were having supper at the table under the apple tree, Stowbroad and another man came out from the woods.
"You just say, and I'll send them on their way,"
Ruby said. Ada said,
"We have plenty."
The two men sat down, and Ruby handed them food, which they ate fast. At first, Ruby refused to speak, and Stowbroad talked about the war with Ada, saying how he hoped it would end so he could come down from the mountain.
"It's no joke living on the mountain,"
Stowbroad said.
"That Teague and his men are killers." "Who's your friend?"
Ruby asked Stowbroad.
"That's Pangle. He's not very smart."
Pangle was a soft, fat thing with a big round head and hair that was almost white. He had no talent in the world, except a recently discovered ability to play the fiddle. But he was gentle and kind and looked on everything that happened with soft, wide eyes. When supper was done, Stowbroad lifted his sack off the ground and took a fiddle from it. He told the women that something about the war had completely changed how he felt about music.
"Some say I fiddle now like a man wild with fever,"
he said. He told them how, in January 1862, a man had come into the army camp asking for a fiddler. The man's 15-year-old daughter was dying, and the girl had asked for fiddle music to be played to help the pain. Stowbroad had picked up his instrument and followed the man to his house. He had played some dance tunes to the girl as she lay dying, and when he had finished, she had asked him to play something of his own. Stowbroad was surprised by this request and sat thinking for a minute. Then he started playing and was surprised by the sad, beautiful sound that came from the fiddle. When he was done, the girl looked at him and said,
"That was fine."
And then she turned her face away and died. Since then, music had become more and more important to Stowbroad. He lost all interest in the war, and instead spent his time learning new tunes from other fiddlers and making up his own. By now, he knew 900 fiddle tunes, many of which he had written himself.
"Well, play then,"
Ruby said. Stowbroad sat and thought for a minute, then started to play. The tune was slow and sad, quite difficult to play, and very beautiful. Ruby and Ada listened in surprise. To Ada, Stowbroad's playing seemed to show that even a man like Ruby's father could learn and change for the better. When Stowbroad had finished, he played other wild and beautiful tunes of his own, and Pangle took his fiddle and played with him. As the last tune came to an end, Stowbroad smiled a deep, long smile of silent joy.
"He's done you some good there,"
Pangle said to Ada. And then he seemed shocked that he had spoken directly to her, and put his head down, and then looked off into the woods. Stowbroad said, "I want to ask you something."
"What?"
Ruby said.
"The problem is, I need help. I'm frightened."
He explained that the group of outliers he was living with had started robbing farms. He was afraid that they would attract the attention of the law, and that the Home Guard would come for them. Stowbroad had decided to leave the group, taking Pangle, who was one of the group, with him. He needed a promise of food, a place like the barn to stay in bad weather, and maybe now and then a little money.
"Eat roots,"
said Ruby.
"Drink muddy water." "Have you not got more feeling than that for your daddy?"
Stowbroad said.
"When I was not yet 8, you left me to look after myself for 3 months. And there's this. If the stories about Teague are even half true, we have plenty to worry about if we shelter you. This is not my place. But if it was, I'd say no."
With that, Ruby rose and walked off into the darkness. Some time later, having sent Stowbroad off with half promises of food, Ada was sitting out on the porch, looking at the moon, which was full and high, and throwing such light that every tree had a blue shadow. She thought about a love song that Stowbroad had sung that night. Its last line was, "Come back to me is my request." Stowbroad had sung the line with feeling, and Ada had to admit that at least now and then it was important to say what your heart felt, straight and simple. She had never been able to do it in her whole life, but she thought that she would try now. She went into the house and came back with pen, ink, and paper, then stared at the paper for some minutes. None of the words that came into her head seemed real. Finally, she wrote, "Come back to me is my request." She signed her name and folded the paper and addressed it to the hospital in the capital. Then she wrapped herself tight in the blankets, and soon she was asleep. Chapter 9. Death in the Mountains. If the part of the mountain they climbed had a name, Stowbroad did not know it. He and the 2 men with him walked looking down at the ground, their hats pulled over their noses and their hands pulled up into their coat sleeves to protect them from the cold. The Pangle boy was close behind Stowbroad, and the third figure followed 6 steps back. The night before, they had found a couple of dead rabbits and had lit a fire and cooked and eaten them. Now they regretted it, because they all had bad stomach pains, and from time to time one of them had to go off behind a bush. It was almost dawn, and there was no color to anything, only shades of brown and gray. They came to a piece of flat ground where 3 paths met. The 3 men stood together, breathless from the climb.
"It's cold,"
the 3rd man said. He had been one of the group at the Outliers Cave and had never offered a name. He was from Georgia, a boy of no more than 17 years, black-haired, brown-skinned. He had fought in the war for a year, then left to walk back home. It had taken him 3 months to reach Cold Mountain, and he had been found by one of the outliers, wandering aimlessly in the forest. The men had agreed that he should leave with Stobrod and Pangle, who were setting off alone to find a cave to live in somewhere near the Shining Rocks. First, however, they had gone to a hiding place where Ruby had hidden some food. Stobrod had told the boy about Ada and Ruby, and how Ada had persuaded Ruby to feed them, although the women could not give quite enough for the men to live on. Ruby would not allow the men to visit the farm, as she thought it was too dangerous, so she left the food in a place that she had discovered as a child. They had gone there before they started on their journey, and found cornmeal, dried apple, and some meat and beans.
"Do you know which path we want?"
the Georgia boy said now to Stobrod. But Stobrod was not at all sure where they were, nor which way they were going. Pangle watched him for some minutes, and then, apologizing, said he knew exactly where he was, and that the right-hand path went right across the mountain and was the path they wanted.
"We'll cook a meal and go on then,"
Stobrod said. The men built a small fire and boiled up some cornmeal. They sat as near to the flames as they could and passed a bottle, waiting for the fire and drink to warm them up. The Georgia boy sat bent over, with a hand on his stomach.
"If I'd known I'd feel this bad, I wouldn't have eaten one mouthful of that rabbit,"
he said. He stood and walked slowly into the trees. Stobrod's head fell sleepily to his chest, and when he looked up again, he was looking at 3 men on horses, their guns pointing at him. Stobrod started to get up.
"Sit still,"
Teague said.
"I'm not even going to ask you if you have papers. We're looking for a group of outliers living in a cave. They've been robbing farms. If a man knew where that cave was, it might help him." "I don't exactly know," Stobrod said. "I'd say if I did."
His voice was quick and bright, but inside he was thinking that in a month he'd be back in Virginia, using a gun. Pangle looked in surprise at Stobrod.
"That's not true," he said. "You know exactly where it is."
And he gave a detailed description of how to find the cave.
"Thanks,"
Teague said, and smiled at his men, and they all climbed off their horses.
"We'll join you at your fire and take breakfast with you."
They built up the fire and sat around it, like friends. The guards had meat with them, and they cooked and ate it, offering some to the outliers. Teague took a bottle from his coat and handed it around. When they had finished eating, Teague looked at the fiddles, which were lying on the ground, and said,
"Can you play those things?"
"A bit," Stobrod said.
"Play me something then,"
Teague said. Stobrod did not much want to. He was tired, and he guessed that his audience did not take pleasure from music. But he picked up his fiddle and started to play, and Pangle joined him. Teague and his men had never before heard such strange, wild music, nor heard anyone play with such feeling and skill. When they had finished, Birch said to Teague,
"Good God, these are strange men."
Teague looked off into the distance. He stood and straightened his coat Then he took his gun and pointed it at the two men.
"Stand up against that big tree," he said.
The two men went and stood against it, holding their fiddles in front of them. Pangle put his free arm around Stowbroad's shoulders. The guards raised their guns, and Pangle gave them a friendly smile.
"I can't shoot a man who's smiling at me," one of the men said. "Stop smiling,"
Teague said to Pangle. Pangle tried to stop smiling, but without success.
"Take your hat off and hold it over your face,"
Teague said. Pangle raised his hat and put it over his face. And when he did, the guards fired. Pieces of wood flew from the tree trunk, where the bullets struck after passing through the meat of the two men.
And when they had finished, they didn't cover them or even go and stand over them to say words. They just got on their horses and rode off. I don't know what kind of place this is, where people kill each other that way."
The Georgia boy sounded like someone who had had a terrible shock.
"I saw it all," he said. "Saw it all." "Then why were you not killed or taken, if you were close enough to witness?"
Ada said. The boy thought about it.
"I heard what I didn't see, anyway," he answered. "I'd stepped into the woods. I needed to be private." "We get your meaning,"
Ruby said.
"I came here as fast as I could. I remembered where the fiddler said you lived." "How long ago?"
Ruby asked. The boy thought for a moment.
6 or 7 hours. "You can guide us back there,"
Ada said. But the boy did not wish to go back up the mountain, and would, he claimed, rather be shot where he stood than visit it again. Ruby said,
"Do as you want. We have no need of you. I know the place you're talking of. We'll feed you, though."
She opened the gate and let the boy into the yard. Ada stepped to her side and looked at her face, then reached out and touched the dark hair at Ruby's neck. But Ruby twisted her neck away and did not cry or show any sign of sadness. She expressed only one concern. Should they bury the men on the mountain or bring them to Black Cove?
"We can't just go up there and dig a hole,"
Ada said.
"If it was me, I'd rather rest on the mountain than anywhere else,"
said Ruby. Ada could find no argument to that. She reached out and put her arms around Ruby, for comfort, if nothing else. But Ruby just stood with her arms by her sides. The women made food for the boy, then started planning their journey. They packed blankets and shovels, cooking pots, matches, rope, a gun, lamps, and grain for the horse. Ruby decided that pants were more practical, and they found 2 pairs of heavy wool hunting pants. They put on wool shirts and sweaters and big hats. Then they gave the boy food and blankets and told him to sleep in the barn until dark made it safe for him to travel. When they left leading the horse, the boy waved to them like a host, saying goodbye to his guests. Toward evening, snow fell through fog in the woods. Ada and Ruby walked under the trees, faint shapes moving through a place that had no color except shades of gray and black. They had climbed for a long time, and were now going down into a valley. Light snow was falling, and for a time they walked by a stream. But then the path they were following turned back into the forest. They walked on past sunset, and the snow started falling harder. In time, they came to an area with great flat rocks. Ruby looked around until she found the place that she was looking for, one that she had known as a child, where 3 rocks had fallen together to make a natural shelter. There was a little stream 20 meters away. The women gathered the driest wood they could find, made a fire at the entrance to the shelter, and boiled a pot of water for tea. Then they sat and drank it, and ate a few dried apples and dry bread. The temperature was dropping fast, but the fire soon heated the stones, and when Ada and Ruby wrapped themselves in blankets and buried themselves among the dry leaves, they were warm as lying in a bed at home. "This is fine," Ada thought as she lay there. She watched the fire shadows and listened to the sound of snow in the leaves, and soon she slept a dreamless sleep, not even waking when Ruby rose to put more wood on the fire. Next morning, they found the Pangle boy lying alone beneath the big tree, covered in snow. Ruby brushed away the snow to look at his face, and when she did, she saw that he was still smiling. She put her hand to his fat cheek and then touched her fingers to his forehead. Ada turned from him.
"Where is he?"
she said.
"No man from Georgia can tell more than half the truth,"
Ruby said.
"Dead or alive, they took him with them."
They started digging a deep hole, and soon they were so hot in their coats that they had to take them off. When the hole was deep enough, they went to Pangle and each took a leg and slid him into the grave. By the time they had covered him, Ada was crying, though she had seen the boy only once in life. She made a cross from 2 thin branches and stood it in the soft ground at Pangle's head, and though she did not say words aloud over him, she said some in her mind. Then she went through the woods to the stream and knelt and washed her hands and face. She looked around and saw a low rock that formed a kind of shelter. Under it sat Stowbroad, his eyes closed and his legs crossed, with his fiddle in his lap.
"Ruby,"
Ada called.
"Ruby, I need you here."
They stood over him, and his face was the color of the snow, since he had lost a great deal of blood. Such a little man. Ruby put her ear to his chest and listened.
"He's alive,"
she said. She took off his clothes and found he had been hit 3 times. The most serious wound was a bullet that had gone through his chest into his back. Stowbroad remained unconscious while Ruby lit a match and held a knife in the flame. Then she cut into Stowbroad's back, and he still made no sound as she put a finger around the bullet and pulled it out.
"You boil some water,"
Ruby said to Ada. She wandered off through the woods, returning an hour later with roots she had found that she thought could be useful. She cut them up and packed them around Stowbroad's wounds, holding them there with pieces of blanket. After a time, she said,
"It's too far home. He won't get there alive. And last night's shelter is too small for all of us. There's a place I know, if it's still there."
They carried Stowbroad across the stream in blankets and laid him over the horse, then set off, the sky flat and gray above them. They walked for some time without speaking, except when Ruby said,
"Here,"
and then they turned. After some hours, they started going down into a valley, moving toward a stream that they could hear but not see. Ada began to see shapes through the trees. Cabins. A tiny Cherokee village. A ghost town. Its people forced to leave by their enemies. Ada thought of Inman's story. She wondered if any of those who had lived in the village were still alive, and if they remembered this lonely place. Ruby chose the best of the cabins, and they took Stowbroad off the horse and lay him on the dusty floor. The house had one windowless room and the rich smell of 1,000 old campfires. While Ruby built a fire, Ada looked after the horse, which was wet and shaking. She looked at him and at the sky and thought that he might be dead on the ground by morning. She tried to lead him into the cabin, but he did not want to go. And finally, she used a big stick and hit him with it until he went in. It was almost dark, and Ada felt tired and cold and frightened. This seemed like the loneliest place on earth. Ruby had cooked some cornmeal, but Ada could not eat it. She sat with it in her lap, exhausted and silent. Outside, the snow started to fall again. Chapter 10. The Meeting. When Inman was only a day's journey away from Black Cove, he stopped at a stream to wash himself and his clothes. He built a fire and spread the clothes on bushes near the fire to dry. He hoped to see Ada soon. He had imagined the scene many times, had seen himself walking up the road into Black Cove, exhausted, but with his courage and strength written on his face. He would be washed and in a clean suit. Ada would step out the door dressed in her fine clothes and would know him immediately. She would run to him, rushing across the yard, and then they would hold each other. He had seen it in his mind so often that he was now unable to imagine it any other way. He found his way to Black Cove, taking care not to follow the road until he was near the house. When he came to it, there was smoke from the chimney, but no other sign of life. He knocked at the front door again, but no one came. Then he went to the back door and knocked, and eventually an upstairs window opened, and a black-haired boy asked him who he was and what he wanted. In time, Inman persuaded the Georgia boy to let him in. They sat by the fire, and Inman heard the story of the killings. The boy gave him the best directions he could, and Inman set off again, walking up the mountain. When he reached the place where 3 paths came together, there was hardly enough light for Inman to study the ground and see what story it told. There was black blood beneath a big tree where killing had been done. There had been a recent fire, and tracks led to a cross of sticks standing at the head of a hole that had been filled in. Inman was puzzled, because he knew that 2 men had been buried there, but it seemed that only one had been. There were pieces of root on the ground, and he picked them up and smelled them. He looked to where the tracks led, but he could not see far before they started disappearing in the dark. So he went and sat on a rock and listened to the stream, and tried to invent a story that would explain why the 2 women had gone on across the mountain instead of going back home. But it was hard to think in the state he was in. For 2 days, Inman had not eaten. He looked at the roots on the ground and thought about eating them, but then he picked them up and threw them into the stream. He intended to fast until he found Ada. If she would not have him, he would go on to the heights and see if the doors of the shining rocks would open to him. Inman could think of no reason to hesitate. He would walk right out of this world and keep on going into that happy valley the old Cherokee Indian woman had described. Inman lit a fire and rolled 2 large stones into it to heat. For a long time he lay wrapped in his blankets with his feet to the fire. His thoughts came and went, and he had no control over them. Inman was afraid that he was falling apart at a bad time. He had hoped that Ada might save him from his troubles and the bad things he had done in the last 4 years. But a dark voice came into his mind and said that it didn't matter how much you wished for something and prayed for it, you would never get it. You could be far too ruined, with fear and hate eating your heart so that you were ready for your hole in the ground. But another part of Inman knew that there were tracks in the snow, and that if he woke up on one more day, he would follow them wherever they led. The fire began to die out, and he rolled the hot stones onto the ground and stretched out next to them and fell asleep. The cold woke him before dawn, and he set off to follow the tracks, although by now they were very faint. Then snow started falling again, and they started to disappear. Inman began to run. But soon they had gone completely, and Inman stopped in a place where the only sound was of snow falling on snow. He thought that if he lay down, the snow would cover him, and when it melted, it would wash the tears from his eyes. Ada and Ruby slept until Stowbroad began coughing. Ruby went to him, and his eyes opened, but he did not seem to know her. She put her hand to his forehead and said,
"He's burning. Get some water, and I'll put some fresh roots on his wound."
Ada took the pot to the stream and filled it full of water, and gave some of it to the horse. As she returned to the cabin, she saw that there were a dozen wild turkeys among the leafless trees of the hillside. She went in and put the pot by the fire. Stowbroad lay quiet.
"There are turkeys on the hillside,"
she said.
"The gun's over there. Go kill us one,"
Ruby said.
"I've never fired a gun,"
said Ada.
"It's easy."
Ruby picked up the gun and showed Ada how to use it. Ada looked doubtful, and Ruby said,
"The worst you can do is fail to kill a turkey, and we've all done that. Go on."
Ada followed the birds for some time, climbing when they climbed and stopping when they stopped. As she walked, she tried to be quiet and still in her movements. She did not take her eyes off them, and eventually she got to the distance from them that Ruby had advised. She stood quietly, and still they did not see her. Then she raised the gun slowly and fired. And to her surprise, a pair fell. When Ada reached the fallen birds, she found that one was male and one female, and that their feathers shone like metal. Inman heard a shot near where he stood. He took his gun and went forward, holding it loosely in his hand. The light was low, and snow was falling, and had covered the branches of the trees. He walked down into a path, and at the end he seemed to see a figure, and when it saw him, it pointed a gun at him. A hunter, Inman guessed. He called out, saying, "I'm lost," and stepped forward slowly. First, he could see turkeys laid on the ground. Then, he could see Ada's fine face on top of a strange figure wearing pants.
"Ada Munro?"
Inman said.
"Ada?"
She did not answer, but just looked at him, confused, and lowered the gun. She examined him and did not know him. His face was so thin above the beard, and he stared at her out of strange black eyes shining deep under the shadow of his hat. But Inman looked her in the eyes and knew it was Ada, and felt love ringing in his soul. "I've been coming to you on a hard road, and I'm not letting you go," he said. But something in him would not let him step forward to hold her. He held out his empty hands. Ada still did not know him. He seemed a madman, wandering in the storm, knapsack on his back, snow in his beard. She raised her gun again.
"I do not know you,"
she said. When Inman heard the words, he thought, 4 years at war, but back now on home ground, and I'm no better than a stranger here. This is the price I pay for the last 4 years. "I believe I have made a mistake," he said. He turned to walk away, to go on up to the shining rocks and see if they would have him. But there was no path to follow, just trees and snow and his own steps filling fast. He turned back to her and held out his empty hands again and said, "If I knew where to go, I'd go there." Perhaps it was something about his voice, or the angle of his face, but suddenly Ada knew him. She lowered the gun and said his name, and he said yes. Now Ada looked at his face and saw not a madman, but Inman. He was exhausted and thin, but still Inman. There was hunger written on his forehead, like a shadow over him. He needed food, warmth, kindness. In his eyes, she could see that the long war and the hard road home had left his mind and heart half dead. Tears came to her eyes, and she rubbed them away.
"You come with me,"
she said. She picked up the turkeys by their feet and walked off carrying the gun on her shoulder. Inman followed, and he was so tired he did not even think to offer to carry the turkeys for her. As they walked, Ada talked to Inman in the voice she had heard Ruby use to speak to the horse when it was nervous. The words did not matter. So she talked of the first thing that came to her, describing the village below, and saying that it looked like a famous picture that she had seen on her travels with Monroe. Inman was too tired to understand what she said. He only knew that she seemed to know her destination, and that something in her voice said,
"This minute I know more than you do, and I know that everything might be fine."
Chapter 11. A Time to Love. The cabin was hot and bright from the fire, and with the door shut, it was hard to say if it was morning or night outside. Ruby had made coffee. Ada and Inman sat drinking it, so close to the fire that the melted snow in their coats steamed around them. Nobody said much, and the place seemed tiny with 4 people in it. Stowbroad moved his head from side to side. His eyes had a look of confusion and hurt in them. Then he lay still again. Tired and warm from the fire, Inman could not keep his eyes open. There were so many things he wanted, but the first thing he needed was sleep. Ada folded a blanket and put it on the floor. She led him to it, and he stretched out and fell asleep fully clothed. While Inman and Stowbroad slept, the snow fell and fell, and the 2 women spent a cold and almost wordless hour collecting wood and cleaning out another of the cabins. They built a hot fire in it, then cleaned the turkeys, put them on the end of long sticks, and roasted them all day over a slow fire. For a long time they sat close to the fire together, and neither of them spoke. Night came, and Ruby said,
"I was watching you this morning with him, and I've been thinking."
"What?"
Ada asked. "We're just starting. I've got a picture in my mind of how that cove needs to be. It will take a long time, but I know how to get there. War or peace, there's nothing we can't do ourselves. You don't need him."
"I know I don't need him,"
Ada said.
"but I think I want him."
"Well, that's different."
Ada paused, thinking hard. She knew that Inman had been alone too long, an outlier without the comfort of a human touch. A loving hand laid soft and warm on his shoulder, back, leg. And she too was lonely. Finally, she said aloud,
"I don't want to find myself someday in a new century, an old, bitter woman looking back, knowing that I hadn't had the courage to follow my heart."
It was after dark when Inman woke. The fire had burned low, and there was no way to tell what time of night it was. He turned and saw Stowbroad, his eyes black and shining in the light. Stowbroad looked at Inman and said, "Any water?" Inman could not see any in the room, so he rose. "I'll get you a drink," he said. He stepped outside, and when he could see enough to walk, he went down to the stream and filled his bottle with water. He could see firelight shining yellow from the cabin where he had slept, and also from another, further down the stream. He smelled meat cooking, and felt suddenly very hungry. He went back inside and raised Stowbroad and slowly poured water into his mouth. Then he built the fire up, and leaving Stowbroad asleep, he walked down to the other lighted cabin. "Hello?" Inman said, and Ruby came to the door and looked out. "I woke up," Inman said. "I don't know how long I was asleep."
"You've slept 12 hours or more,"
Ruby said, and moved so that he could come in. Ada sat cross-legged on the ground beside the fire, and as Inman entered, she looked up at him. Her dark hair was loose on her shoulders, and Inman thought her as beautiful a sight as men are allowed to see. He did not know what to do with himself, but thought that he would go and sit beside her. Then Ada rose and did a thing he knew he would never forget. She reached behind him and put one hand on his back, at his waist. The other she pressed against his stomach.
"You feel so thin between my hands,"
she said. Inman could think of no answer that suited the moment. Ada took her hands away and said,
"When did you last eat?"
Inman counted back. 3 days, he said, or 4.
"Well then, you must be hungry."
Ada sat him down by the fire and gave him a plate of turkey with fried apple rings. Inman started eating hungrily, but then he stopped and said, "Are you not having any?"
"We ate some time ago,"
Ada said. Ruby picked up a pot of soup and stood up, saying,
"I'll see if I can get him to take some of this, and I'm going to clean that wound and sit with him for a time."
After Ruby left, neither Inman nor Ada could think of anything much to say. Inman began commenting on the food, but then he stopped and felt foolish. He wanted to lie on the blankets with Ada beside him and hold her close. He knew that it had taken all her courage to touch him as she had. Now he had to find a way to say what he had to say. He went and sat behind her, then reached around her and pressed the inside of his wrists and arms against her shoulders. "Did you write me letters while I was in the hospital?" he said.
"Several,"
she said.
"but I did not know you were there until you were gone. So the first 2 letters went to Virginia."
"Tell me what they were about," he said. Ada described them, and Inman said, "I'd love to have read them." He held his hands to the fire and said, 26 years since a fire was lit here." This gave them a topic, and they sat for a time talking about the Cherokee village, imagining the lives that had been lived in that place. When they had finished, they sat quietly, and then Inman told Ada how all the way home his only hope was that she would have him, would marry him. But now, he said, he could not ask her to do so, not to a man as ruined as he was. "I'm ruined beyond repair, I fear," he said. Ada turned and looked at him over her shoulder. She could see the white wound at his neck, and there were other wounds in the look of his face and in his eyes, which could not quite meet hers. She turned back. She knew that cures of all sorts exist in the natural world. Even the most hidden root had a use. She had learned this, at least, from Ruby. Without looking at him, she said,
"I know people can be healed. Not all, but some can be. Why not you?"
"Why not me?" said Inman, testing the thought. He reached to Ada's dark hair, which lay loose on her back, and lifted it. Leaning forward, he touched his lips to the back of her neck and kissed the top of her head. Then he leaned back and pulled her against him, her waist into his stomach, her shoulders into his chest. He held her tight, and words poured out of him. He told her about the first time he had looked on the back of her neck as she sat in church, of the feeling that had never let go of him since. He talked of the wasted years between then and now, and how you never get back the things you have lost. They will always stay lost. You can only choose to go on or not, and if you go on, you carry your wounds with you. But during all those wasted years, he had had the wish to kiss her, there at the back of her neck. And now he had done it. Ada knew that Inman was trying to thank her for the touch she had given him when he entered the cabin. She lifted her hair from her shoulders and put her head slightly forward.
"Do that once more,"
she said. But there was a sound at the door, and Ruby came in and saw the two looking uncomfortable. Nobody said anything.
"His fever's down now,"
Ruby said finally. Inman returned to the other cabin to sleep. As he lay there, he tried to decide which part of the evening he had enjoyed most: Ada's hand on his stomach, or her request just before Ruby opened the door. He was still trying to decide when he fell asleep. The next day was gray and even colder, with snow falling soft and fine. They all slept late, and Inman took breakfast in the women's hut. Then, later in the morning, Ada and Inman fed and watered the horse and went hunting together. They walked up the hill and found nothing moving in the woods, not even animal tracks in the snow. Eventually, they came to a flat rock, and Inman brushed the snow from it, and they sat cross-legged, facing each other, knee to knee. Ada began talking. She wanted to tell how she had become what she was. They were different people now. He needed to know that. She told of Monroe's death, and about deciding not to return to Charleston, and all about Ruby, about weather and animals and plants, and the things that she was starting to know. She still missed Monroe more than she could say, and she told Inman many wonderful things about him. But she told as well one terrible thing: that he had tried to keep her a child, and that he had mostly succeeded.
"And there's something you need to know about Ruby,"
Ada said.
"Whatever happens between you and me, I want her to stay in Black Cove as long as she wants. If she never leaves, I'll be glad."
"Could she learn to accept me? That's the question," Inman said.
"I think she can,"
Ada said.
"If you understand, she is not a servant, but my friend."
They returned to the village that afternoon, carrying only wood for the fire. They found Ruby sitting by Stowbroad. He seemed to know Ruby and Ada, but he was frightened of Inman.
"Who's that big, dark man?"
he said. Ruby wet a cloth and cleaned his face, and when she was done, he immediately fell asleep. Ada looked at Inman, the tiredness in his face. She said,
"I believe you ought to do the same."
"Just don't let me sleep past dark," Inman said. He went out and returned a minute later with a pile of wood for the fire. Then he left, and the two women built the fire up and sat together for a long time with their backs against the cabin wall, a blanket around them. Then they slept, and when they woke, it was almost dark. Ruby went to check Stowbroad.
"His fever's up again,"
she said.
"He'll stay or go, but tonight we'll decide. I'd better not leave him."
Ada came over and felt Stowbroad's forehead. It did not feel too hot to her. She looked at Ruby, but Ruby would not look back. It was dark when Ada walked down the stream to the other cabin. She opened the door quietly and entered. Inman lay asleep and did not move. The fire had burned low. Ada took off her coat and put 3 branches on the fire, then went to Inman and knelt beside him. She touched his forehead and stroked his hair. He woke slowly, turning to look at her, but then his eyes closed and he slept again. The world was such a terribly lonely place, and the only cure seemed to be to lie down beside him, skin to skin. Ada felt very frightened, but she put the fear away from her and started undoing the buttons on her pants. They were almost off when she looked towards Inman and found his eyes open, watching her.
"Turn your back,"
she said. "Not for all the gold dollars in the world," Inman said. She turned away from him, nervous and uncomfortable. But he leaned forward and pulled the clothes from her hands and pulled her to him. Gently, he moved his hands up and down her, then pressed his forehead to her soft stomach and kissed her there. He pulled her against him and held her and held her. She put a hand to the back of his neck and pulled him harder, and then she pressed her white arms against him. And for a time that night, the cabin was a place that held within its walls no pain, or even a faint memory of pain. Later, Ada and Inman lay holding each other as the branches smoked in the fire and the snow whispered as it fell. And they did what lovers often do when they think the future stretches endlessly before them. They talked of the past, through most of the night, describing their childhood and youth in great detail. When they reached the war years, Inman only described them very generally and said little about himself.
"Then tell me of your long journey home,"
Ada said. Inman thought about it, but then he let himself imagine that he had at last reached the end of his troubles. He had no wish to revisit them. So he told only of how on his journey he had watched the nights of the moon and counted them to 28 and then started all over again. Then he added, "I met a number of people on the way. There was a goat's woman that fed me." They turned to the future and started talking about their plans. They imagined their marriage, the years passing happy and peaceful, with Black Cove organized according to Ruby's plans. Ada described these plans in detail, and the only thing Inman requested was that they should keep a few goats. In fall, the apple trees would be bright and heavy with apples, and they would hunt birds together, and in summer they would catch fish. They were both at the age when they could think in one part of their minds that their whole lives stretched in front of them. At the same time, another part guessed that their youth was almost finished for them, and that a very different country lay ahead. Chapter 12. The Last Goodbye. By the morning of the third day in the village, the sky had cleared and there was bright sun. The snow began to melt, dropping from the bent branches of trees, and all day there was the sound of water running under the snow on the ground. That evening the moon was full, and its bright light threw shadows of tree trunks on the snow. Ada and Inman lay under the covers for some time, talking, with the fire low and the door to the cabin open, letting a bar of cold moonlight shine onto their bed. They made a plan for themselves and discussed it for much of the night. They felt certain that the South was going to lose the war, which could not go on many more months. It certainly would not continue past late summer. The choices were these. Inman could return to the army. He would immediately be sent back to Petersburg, where he would try not to get killed and hope for an early end to the war. Or he could stay hidden in the mountains or in Black Cove as an outlier and be hunted like a wild animal. Or he could cross the mountains north and give himself up to the Federals. They would make him sign a document saying he was loyal to their cause, but then he could wait for the fighting to end and come home. He tried to think of other plans, but finally they had to accept that the three original choices, although they were hard, were the only ones the war allowed. Inman could not accept the first suggestion. Ada felt that the second was too dangerous. So they decided on the third, over the mountains. 3 days or 4 of steady walking, and then he would cross into the next state, put up his hands, and say that the South had been beaten. In the end, They both promised to keep in their minds Inman's return home in 3 or 4 months' time. They would go forward from there into whatever new world the war left behind, and they would do their best to create the future that they had imagined in their talks 2 nights ago. On the 4th day in the village, brown leaves and black dirt started to appear on the ground. That day, Stowbroad could sit up without support, and they could mostly understand what he said. His wounds were clean, and he could eat solid food. By the 5th day, the snow was more than half gone, and Stowbroad announced that he was ready to travel.
6 hours home, Ruby said. 7 at most.
Ada thought that they would all go as a group, but Inman would not allow it.
"Why put everyone in danger when it's us they want?" he said, pointing in Stowbroad's direction.
He suggested that Ruby and Ada walk on ahead, while he and Stowbroad followed a short way behind, with Stowbroad on the horse. They would wait in the woods until dark. The next morning, he would start on his journey into the next state. The women would keep Stowbroad hidden at home, and if the war had not ended by the time he had healed, they would send him across the mountains to join Inman. Stowbroad had no opinion on the matter, but Ruby agreed with Inman, so that is what they did. The women started walking, and Inman stood and watched them climb the hillside. When Ada disappeared into the trees, a part of the richness of the world seemed to go with her. He had been alone in the world, and empty for so long, but she filled him full, and he believed that perhaps everything that had been taken out of him had been for a purpose, to clear space for something better. He waited for a time, and then put Stowbroad on the horse and followed, passing Pangle's grave, still covered with snow. They traveled for some distance, dark clouds floating above them, the path rough and steep. Then they heard sounds behind them, and turned to see horsemen on the path.
"Good God,"
Stowbroad said. Teague said,
"That's a hard man to kill."
Stowbroad looked at the men and recognized Teague and the boy he kept at his side. The other 3 men he did not know. Inman looked around to see what protection there was. He wanted a stone wall, but there was none. He studied the guards, and he knew them by the look in their eye. There was no point in talking with such men. Language would change nothing. He hit the horse hard with his left hand and pulled out his pistol with his right, shooting one of the men in a single movement. Stowbroad's horse went running down the path and disappeared into the trees. There was a moment of stillness, and then a great deal of movement. The horses all jumped, and the riders pulled at their heads to calm them down. Inman ran straight at the group. There was no wall to get behind, no hope to do anything except run into them and try to kill them all. He shot one rider off his horse. That left only 3, and one was already moving away toward the trees. Inman fired again, and a horse came down, falling on the leg of one of the riders, who shouted in pain. The other horse started spinning out of control, and Teague almost came off. Inman ran to him and pulled the gun from his hand. The 2 men looked each other in the eyes, and Teague pulled out a long knife and shouted, "I'll blacken my knife with your blood." Inman fired, and the bullet hit Teague in the chest. He fell to the ground, screaming and swearing. Inman hit him on the side of the head with his gun, and the man stopped screaming. Inman looked around for the last rider. He expected the man to have run away, but he found him about 50 meters away, hiding behind a tree. Inman saw that he was only a boy, and that he had lost his hat. His head was white. He probably had German or Dutch blood in him. But he was now American. White skin, white hair, and a killer. He looked very young, and Inman did not want to shoot a boy.
"Come out of there,"
Inman said, making his voice loud enough to be heard. Nothing. The boy stayed behind the tree.
"Come on," Inman said. "I'm not asking again.
Put down your gun and you can ride home." "No, sir," the boy said. "Here's fine." "Listen," Inman said, "I'm looking for a way not to kill you." "And I'm looking for a way to finish you," said the boy. Inman pointed his gun at the tree. "You're gonna have to come out from behind that tree sometime," he said. The boy and his horse rode off through the woods, and Inman went after him. They chased each other, using the trees to hide behind, and the horse became confused and started jumping around, throwing the boy off her. He lay in the snow where he had fallen. Then he half sat and put his hand to his gun. "Put that thing down," Inman said. He had his gun pointed at the boy. The boy looked at him, and his blue eyes were empty as ice. He looked white in the face, a little blonde thing, his hair cut close to his head. Only his hand moved, and it moved quicker than you could see. Inman suddenly lay on the ground. The boy sat and looked at him, and then looked at the pistol in his hand. Ada heard the gunshots in the distance, dry and thin as sticks breaking. She did not say anything to Ruby. She just turned and ran. Her hat flew off her head, and she kept running and left it on the ground like a shadow behind her. She met Stobrod, holding tight onto his horse. "Back there," Stobrod said. When she reached the place, the boy had already gathered the horses and gone. She went to the men on the ground and looked at them, and then she found Inman lying apart from them. She sat and held him in her lap. He tried to talk, but she silenced him. He floated in and out of a bright dream of home. It had a stream rising out of rock, black dirt fields, old trees. In his dream, the years seemed to be happening all at one time, all the seasons coming together. Apple trees heavy with fruit and flowers, ice around the stream, red fall leaves floating down on summer roses. From a distance, it looked like a charming scene in the winter woods. A stream, a pair of lovers, the man lying with his head in the woman's lap, she looking down into his eyes, stroking his hair, he putting an arm around the softness of her body, both touching each other with great closeness. A scene of such quiet and peace that the observer could imagine that long years of happy union stretched ahead of the two on the ground. Chapter 13. October 1874. Even after all this time and 3 children together, Ada still found them holding each other at the strangest moments. Earlier that day, it had been out in the potato field. They had stood, their legs wide, each with one arm around the other hand on their shovels. Ada had found them standing there and had wanted to make a comment, but had said nothing. The Georgia boy had never gone back home and had become a man in Black Cove. Ruby had kept him working hard for 2 years, and she did not stop when he became her husband. His name was Reed. Their babies had been born 18 months apart, all boys, with thick black hair and shiny brown eyes. They were growing into short, strong boys with pink cheeks and happy smiles, and Ruby made them work hard and play hard. Now, late in the afternoon, the 3 boys sat around a fire behind the house. 4 small chickens were roasting over the fire as the boys argued about who should turn them. Ada watched them as she spread a cloth on the small table under the apple tree and placed 8 plates on it. October 1874 was as fine as the month can be in the mountains. It had been dry and warm and clear for weeks, and the leaves were half red and half green. The color of Cold Mountain behind the house changed each day, and if you watched closely,
You could follow the red as it came down the mountain and spread into the cove like a wave breaking over you slowly. Soon, with an hour of daylight left, Ruby came out from the kitchen. At her side was a tall girl of 9, both of them carrying baskets of potato salad, corn, cornbread, green beans. Reed took the chickens from the fire, and Ruby and the girl spread the food on the table. Stowbroad came and put a bucket of milk by the table. They all took their places. Later, as the sun was setting, Stowbroad took out his fiddle and played, while the children ran around the fire and shouted. They were not dancing, but just running to the music, and the girl waved a burning stick until Ada told her to stop it. The girl said, "But Mama," and Ada shook her head. The girl came and kissed her cheek and danced away and threw the stick into the flames. When Stowbroad at last stopped playing, the children sat down by the fire. Ada took a book and began to read them a story. She turned the pages with slight difficulty because she had lost the end of the first finger on her right hand 4 years previously. She had been up on the hill cutting trees and had by accident taken her fingertip off. Ruby had cared for it, and a year later it had healed so well that you hardly noticed the difference. When Ada reached the end of the story, the night was growing cool, and she put the book away. The children were sleepy, and morning would come as early and demanding as always. It was time to put out the fire and go inside and lock the door.